Picture the scene. It's April 1980. We're in the Talpiot neighborhood, which is just a few miles south of Jerusalem's Old City, and a construction crew is there, just clearing ground for this new apartment complex.
Right.
So the heavy machinery is ripping into the earth, and suddenly, boom, a bulldozer punches a massive hole straight through the solid bedrock.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And when the dust settles, the crew looks down into the darkness and realizes they haven't just hit rock. They've actually cracked open the roof of an ancient burial cave.
Which, is basically an occupational hazard for construction crews in Jerusalem. I mean, the city has seen so much continuous human habitation that modern expansion is just constantly colliding with antiquity.
Exactly. So the district archaeologist gets this frantic call on a Saturday evening.
Okay.
And they rush this young surveyor, Dr. Shimon Gibson, out to the site. They drop down into the cavern, and they find the space is filled with all this deep soil, which proves the tomb had been open to the elements and, probably looters in antiquity.
Yeah, that's super common.
But sitting right there in the gloom are 10 ancient stone bone boxes, what archaeologists call ossuaries. So they quickly map the cave, measure the boxes, crit them all up, and ship them off to a warehouse. The bulldozer fires back up, the apartments get built. And for like 27 years, those 10 stone boxes are considered a completely mundane, insignificant find.
Just another footnote in the massive catalog of ancient artifacts. Until a highly controversial documentary called The Lost Tomb of Jesus hits the screens.
Right, and the film makes a claim that it's nothing short of explosive.
Yeah.
It basically argues that this entirely unremarkable cave in Talpiot is actually the final physical resting place of Jesus of Nazareth and his earthly family.
It's a massive claim. I mean, it is a theory that, if proven true, fundamentally alters the historical and theological foundation of, the largest religion on the planet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today we are taking a deep dive into how a forgotten construction site discovery could potentially rewrite world history.
Yeah, we really need to look at the raw data here.
Exactly. Our mission today is to objectively examine the historical, archaeological, and scientific claims laid out in our source material. We're going to look at the names carved in stone, the DNA testing, the physical artifacts, and just see exactly how this blockbuster theory was constructed. And of course, how leading experts systematically deconstruct it.
Right, and to even begin evaluating the evidence from the documentary, we have to ground ourselves in the reality of the first century. Like, we need to look at the actual mechanics of how people in this specific region buried their dead, because it is entirely different from modern practices.
Yeah, I'm assuming they weren't just, lowering a wooden casket into the earth and walking away.
Far from it. So between roughly 20 BCE and 70 CE, which is a very tight window, historically speaking, there was this unique Jewish burial practice in Jerusalem, and it was driven by a rising theological belief in a literal physical resurrection at the end of days. Because of that belief, the physical bones became incredibly important. So when someone died, the body was placed on a carved rock shelf inside a family tomb. The tomb was sealed, and the body was just left to naturally decompose for about a year.
Wait, so the family tomb wasn't a sealed-off memorial, like it was an active working space. You just left the body out on a slab.
You did, yeah. And a year later, once the flesh had completely decayed, the family returned. They would carefully gather the bare bones and place them into one of those ossuaries we mentioned.
The stone boxes?
Exactly. A limestone box specifically carved to be just long enough to hold the longest bone in the human body, which is the femur.
That is just a fascinating psychological process. I mean, we think of mourning today as a linear journey starting from the funeral. But this ancient practice builds in like a secondary grieving period.
Right.
You have the initial shock of death, and then 12 months later, you return to essentially confront the reality of mortality all over again. You gather the bones, carve the person's name on the box, and store it on a shelf inside the tomb.
Yeah, that secondary burial was really the ultimate act of preservation, keeping the skeleton intact to await that physical resurrection, which actually brings us to the core theological tension outlined in our sources.
Right, the elephant in the room.
Exactly. And we're simply reporting the scholarly perspectives presented here, but the underlying question is massive. If the literal bones of Jesus of Nazareth were found in a limestone box in Talpiot, what happens to traditional Christianity?
And the sources offer two starkly different views on this. You've got Dr. Craig Evans, who looks at this through the lens of traditional first-century belief. He points out that the earliest accounts of Christianity are built on a literal bodily resurrection.
Right, the empty tomb.
Yes, the scriptural narratives describe an empty tomb and followers touching physical wounds. So Evans argues that if you produce a box of bones, it would be devastating to traditional Christian faith. It would essentially mean the foundational accounts were false.
But then on the other side of the debate, you have Dr. James Tabor, and he actually supports the possibility of the Talpiot tomb theory.
Yeah, his perspective is really interesting.
It is. Tabor suggests that some ancient followers might have held a more sophisticated, like purely spiritual view of resurrection. He uses a rather vivid analogy in the material, actually.
The music video one.
Yes. He argues that ancient believers didn't necessarily picture resurrection like a Michael Jackson music video, with corpses popping out of the dirt. He thinks they might have been experiencing a spiritual presence, which would make physical bones kind of irrelevant to their faith.
I do appreciate Tabor's thriller analogy, but Dr. Evans pushes back on that pretty hard in the source text.
It does.
Evans notes that first-century culture had a very robust vocabulary for ghosts and spirits. If the disciples just saw a spirit, they would have called it a spirit. Instead, they specifically claimed the physical body was gone. But okay, setting the theology aside for a second, I'm stuck on a logistical question.
What's that?
If the implications of finding this family are so monumental, how did the archaeological team in 1980 catalog the tomb and just move on? Like, why wasn't it front-page news back then?
Well, the primary reason is the names. Or actually, more accurately, the absolute lack of uniqueness regarding the names.
Okay.
The documentary's entire theory relies heavily on the specific inscriptions found on 6 of the 10 ossuaries in that cave.
So let's look at that roster, because this really is the foundation of the film's argument. The inscriptions read, Yeshua bar Yosef, so Jesus, son of Joseph. Then you have Maria, Yosa, which is a diminutive for Joseph,
Yeah.
Mattia, or Matthew, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus, and finally, Miriam Imara.
Right. And the filmmakers take that specific cluster of names, they run a statistical model, and they claim the odds of this group belonging to any family other than the biblical Holy Family is 1 in 600.
1 in 600.
Yeah, and when you throw a number like that out to the public, it sounds mathematically insurmountable, right? Like, it has to be them.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source material takes us out of the realm of abstract statistics and into the physical warehouse of the Israel Antiquities Authority, the IAA. And the raw data completely undercuts the math.
It really does. What's fascinating here is seeing how statistics break down when the underlying assumptions are flawed. Because when you open the IAA catalog and you look at the thousands of ossuaries recovered from the Jerusalem area, you quickly realize these names were ubiquitous.
They were everywhere.
Everywhere. Maria and Miriam were the most popular female names of the era. Up to 25% of all Jewish women in the first century were named Mary or some variation of it.
1 out of every 4 women. Like, if you walk into a crowded market in ancient Jerusalem and yell Mary, a quarter of the women are turning around.
Exactly.
In the IAA catalog alone, out of 231 inscribed boxes, 10 say Maria and another 10 say Miriam. And there are 19 different variations of Joseph, including that nickname Yosa.
Yeah, and Professor Camille Folks, who is a statistician quoted in the sources, voices deep concern over that 1 in 600 calculation. He stresses that you just cannot treat these names as independent, highly unusual variables.
It feels like finding a family cemetery plot from the 1950s with the names John, Mary, and James.
Right.
If someone digs that up 2,000 years from now and notices those names match some famous historical family from a history book, are they going to assume it's a definitive match? You can't take modern concepts of statistical rarity and apply them to ancient, highly repetitive naming conventions.
You really can't. And beyond the commonality of the names, the physical condition of the carvings raises an important question, too. Epigraphers, the scholars who specialize in reading ancient inscriptions, point out that the central Yeshua bar Yosef carving is incredibly messy.
It's hard to read.
Yeah, it is so heavily scratched and poorly executed that in the original 1980 excavation report, the lead archaeologist actually placed a question mark next to the translation of the name Jesus.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't even a definitive reading to the people who first pulled it out of the dirt.
So the epigraphy alone isn't strong enough to prove the documentary's case. And the filmmakers clearly recognize this, which is why they pivoted to what sounds like hard science to lock in their theory. They needed a way to prove that the people in these boxes were connected in very specific ways, which leads to their most sensational claim, the presence of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, and to make that connection, the documentary turns to mitochondrial DNA testing. They took these microscopic samples of biological residue scraped from the bottom of the Jesus ossuary and the Mariamne ossuary.
Let's actually break down the mechanism of that test for a second so we're all on the same page. Mitochondrial DNA isn't like a standard ancestry test that builds your whole family tree. It exclusively traces the maternal line.
Right. Passed from mother to child.
Exactly. So if two people share a mother, or if one is the mother of the other, they will have matching mitochondrial DNA. And when the lab analyzed the residue from the Jesus box and the Mariamne box, the results showed that the samples did not share a maternal line. They were not maternally related.
Right. Which seems like a dead end. But the documentary concludes that because they aren't siblings or mother and son, they must be husband and wife.
Wait, I'm stuck on the logic here. The test simply says these two biological samples don't share a mother.
Yep.
But the film says, therefore, Miriam Jael is Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, and the mother of the Judah found in the other box. That
Yeah.
feels like an astronomical leap. Like, couldn't they be cousins?
Yeah.
Or an aunt? Or just some unrelated person by marriage?
It is a massive leap, and the forensic experts in our source material dismantle it completely. Stephen Cox, a forensic archaeologist who actually worked with the filmmakers to collect the tomb data, highlights the severe limitations of this evidence.
What does he say?
Well, he reminds us of the burial context. You have 10 boxes, right? But those boxes contained the commingled skeletal remains of approximately 35 different individuals spanning as many as 4 generations.
Wow. Which means over the course of decades, people were repeatedly entering this cave, moving boxes around, adding bones, and mixing remains as the family expanded.
Exactly. Furthermore, when you scrape microscopic dust from the bottom of a 2,000-year-old box that has just been sitting in an unsealed cave, you cannot definitively prove that the DNA belongs to the specific individual whose name is scratched on the outside.
Because of contamination.
Right. Cox points out that the DNA test couldn't even confirm if the residue was male or female, or honestly, even human rather than animal contamination. So to take a negative DNA result from a contaminated box and declare you have found the historical wife of Jesus, it's scientifically untenable.
It really illustrates the danger of working backward from a desired conclusion. You start with this sensational idea Jesus was secretly married to Mary Magdalene, and then you wrap it in the undeniable modern credibility of a term like mitochondrial DNA.
It sounds so official.
It does. It creates this veneer of science that masks a completely unscientific chain of assumptions.
Yeah, and that tendency to force evidence to fit the narrative is also clear in how the film treats the inscriptions themselves. Like, the documentary translates the ossuary labeled Mariamne Mara as Mary the Master, and they use that title as proof of Mary Magdalene's elevated status as a religious leader.
But Dr. Emil Puch, who is one of the premier epigraphers in the world, looks at that exact same carving and sees something entirely different. He states with 100% certainty that it isn't a title at all. It is simply 2 distinct names.
Right. Mariamne, a common female name, and Mara, which functions as a masculine name in this context.
So it's 2 people.
Exactly. Dr. Puch concludes that this single ossuary was most likely used to store the bones of a husband and wife who were buried together during that secondary burial process. It has absolutely no linguistic connection to Mary Magdalene, and, as several historians in the source note, there is 0 textual or historical evidence from antiquity to suggest Jesus of Nazareth was ever married anyway.
Okay, so if the statistical models are flawed, the DNA testing doesn't prove relationships, and the inscriptions are misread, the documentary is kind of forced to rely on physical artifacts to link this cave to the biblical narrative. Which brings us to the mystery of the missing box.
Ah, yes, the missing box. So when Shimon Gibson's team cataloged the cave in 1980, they noted 10 ossuaries. But if you visit the IAA warehouse today, you will only find 9 from Talpiot. One of the boxes, which the original report described as completely plain and uninscribed, just vanished somewhere along the way.
And the film takes that missing plain box and builds an incredible theory. They claim it didn't just vanish, they argue it is actually the infamous James ossuary.
Which is a huge claim. For context, the James ossuary is this highly controversial artifact that mysteriously appeared on the antiquities market years ago. It bears the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus.
Right.
So the filmmakers attempt to prove that this famous box was the missing 10th ossuary from Talpiot by using a technique called patina matching.
Patina matching. So patina is essentially the biogeochemical crust that forms on ancient objects, right? Over thousands of years, water drips through the limestone ceiling of a cave, picks up specific environmental minerals, and deposits them onto the surface of the ossuaries, creating this chemical signature.
Exactly.
And the film argues that the patina on the James Ossuary matches the chemical makeup of the Talpiot cave, proving they belong together.
But the scientific pushback on this is swift. Geologists clarify that patina is not a unique, exclusive fingerprint. The environmental conditions, the soil chemistry, the rainfall, the limestone composition are virtually identical across the entire geographic region of East Jerusalem. A patina match only proves the box came from that general area, not from that specific cave to the exclusion of all others.
And even setting the geology aside entirely, the documentary's theory collides with a concrete, chronological roadblock, because an FBI lab analysis verified a photograph showing the James Ossuary sitting on an antiquities collector's shelf in 1976.
Right. That is 4 years before the bulldozer broke into the Talpiot tomb.
The math just doesn't work.
It doesn't. Additionally, geochemists found evidence that the James Ossuary had been exposed to direct sunlight outside of a cave environment for perhaps a century or more. The timelines are entirely incompatible.
But I have to say, my absolute favorite part of this entire investigation is how the documentary treats a specific carving found above the entrance to the Talpiot cave.
Oh, the symbol.
Yes. It's this geometric shape. A chevron resembling an upside-down V with a circle beneath it. The film points to this and declares it is a secret early Christian symbol.
And to corroborate this, they travel to another first-century burial site called Dominus Flevit. Inside that tomb, they find an ossuary bearing the exact same geometric mark, a chevron and a circle. So the filmmakers present this as profound evidence linking the two sites as part of a clandestine network of early Christian burials.
Enter Dr. Stephen Fan, an epigrapher who decides to actually visit the Dominus Flevit site to examine this supposedly profound religious symbol. He looks at the box and notices the lid is missing.
Whoa.
So he asks the curators where the lid is, reasoning that if this is a sacred symbol, it would probably adorn the lid as well. They bring out the lid, he turns it around, and there it is. The exact same chevron and circle are carved into the edge of the lid.
And in that single moment, the entire grand mystery evaporates. It wasn't a religious symbol at all. It was a utilitarian stonemason's mark.
It's the ancient equivalent of an IKEA assembly sticker, like insert tab A into slot B. These limestone boxes and lids were incredibly heavy, hand-carved objects. They weren't perfectly uniform.
No, not at all.
So a stonemason would carve a matching shape on the rim of the box and the edge of the lid, so the grieving family would know exactly which way to slide the heavy stone to make it sit flush. Finding that mark doesn't mean you've discovered a secret cult. It just means someone needed help putting the lid on.
Yeah. And as for the chevron carved over the Talpiot cave itself, Dr. Gibson explains that it was just a standard architectural motif for first-century gables and pediments. It was a common decorative choice of the era, completely devoid of any secret meaning.
So what does this all mean? We look at a basic construction mark and elevate it to a Da Vinci Code level conspiracy. It is staggering to see how easily normal, everyday ancient methods are romanticized when we desperately want to find a hidden narrative.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes a really powerful case study in the methodology of history. You know, you have to let the raw data lead you, even if it leads you to a totally mundane conclusion.
Right.
The documentary starts with an incredibly high-stakes, exciting claim, and it's bolstered by the intimidating language of DNA science and statistical probability.
But when exposed to standard epigraphy, forensic science, and just basic first-century archaeology, the theory completely unravels. The names were ubiquitous, the statistical assumptions were flawed, the DNA couldn't prove identity or marriage, the inscriptions were misread, the missing box was chronologically impossible, and the secret symbols were just mason's marks.
The Talpiot Cave remains an authentic, fascinating first-century tomb. I mean, it gives us valuable insight into burial practices of the era, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence points away from it being the Holy Family.
When you are scrolling through sensational headlines today, this deep dive is really the perfect reminder of why critical thinking is so vital. We live in an era of information overload where narratives constantly compete for our attention.
Absolutely.
And very often, those claims will use the language of science to bypass our skepticism. If an article says mitochondrial DNA, we are instantly conditioned to assume the conclusion must be factual. We have to learn to look past the vocabulary and ask exactly how that science is being applied and whether someone is making massive leaps to reach a profitable conclusion.
Yeah, a critical questioning mind is your best defense against historical fiction that is masquerading as historical fact.
But before we wrap up, there is one provocative thought I want you to mull over. It's something that almost never gets mentioned when people debate the validity of this tomb.
What is it?
Take a step back from the famous names and the Hollywood documentaries. Think about the physical reality of the Talpiot Cave itself. Focus on the skeletal remains of the approximately 35 anonymous individuals who were actually buried in those 10 boxes over the course of 4 generations.
The real people who mourned, gathered bones, and actually utilized that space.
Exactly. Even if they aren't the central figures of the New Testament, those 35 people were alive in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. They lived through one of the most turbulent, pivotal eras in human history. They shopped in the local markets, they paid taxes to Rome, they navigated the same dusty streets, and they may have very well brushed shoulders in the crowds with the exact historical figures we are still debating today.
And by trying to force them into a grand, extraordinary narrative, we ironically end up erasing the very real, deeply human history they actually left behind.
We open up ancient sites hoping to find a pristine time capsule with a neat and tidy answer. But what we usually find is something much more profound. We find a messy, complicated labyrinth of ordinary people just trying to honor their dead and navigate their lives. And sometimes exploring the reality of those ordinary lives is where the best history is found. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some incredible insights to chew on. Keep asking questions, always look past the headlines, and as always, stay curious.